cities were a pinnacle of civilization across the ancient Near East, and therefore seen as vitally important to civilization. We see evidence of this in the Eridu Genesis, which after the creation of humans and animals proceeds to narrate how the mother goddess Nintur establishes great cities and their kings. The importance of both the city and the king is something that can be seen across all of the ancient Near East, with perhaps the clearest example from both within the biblical text and surrounding text is the city of Babylon. This is vitally important to ancient Egypt as well. They were centers of religion, trade, as well as political power. They were often built near the Nile River, which was also a personified deity within ancient Egypt, and this was for access to its resources as well as transportation. However, this is in stark contrast to what we find within the biblical text. The first instance we see of the city is opposed to the garden paradise of Eden Yahweh created for humanity. And this is because the person that builds the first city within the biblical text is Cain. This is Genesis chapter 4, verse 17, where Cain, after murdering his brother Abel, is banished east away from God's presence. And Cain takes a wife, he has a son, and Cain is essentially worried that people are going to kill him. And instead of trusting that he would be avenged if that were to take place, Cain builds a city and names it after his son. And this starts a long line of the city being a place within the biblical text where cities are portrayed as a response to human violence and corruption. And this is not to say that all cities are bad within the biblical text. There's obviously the city of Jerusalem. And in fact, Jerusalem, and specifically the temple, is built as a reflection of the garden in Eden. Back to Cain's story, after Cain founds this first city, what ends up happening within the progression of Genesis 1 through 11 is you get one of Cain's descendants, a man named Lamech, who is the first person within the biblical text to take two wives, and this is portrayed as a very negative thing as well. And then in poetic form, Lamech openly boasts to his wives about how he is a murderer. And eventually through a sequence of events, this leads to the Tower of Babel, where all of the people gather together as one to make their name great by making the tower that reaches up to the heavens. And essentially this was to tame a deity, and therefore anyone that wanted to worship this deity would have to come to that city to worship him, therefore making the city great. This is in direct opposition to the Edenic mandate of being fruitful and multiplying across the earth. And this is the point within the biblical story where God has had enough and disperses the people, and he allots them away to the sons of God, which can be read about in Deuteronomy 32. And to summarize this topic of cities, what we find is that within every other text aside from the biblical text, the city was viewed as an ideal place. It was a place where religion and politics thrived, whereas within the biblical text, the garden setting was viewed as the ideal, a place where one would not have to build up walls for fear of human corruption and violence. And now that we've broadly covered these four topics, we can return to the original question. Was Genesis 1 through 11 inspired by other ancient Near Eastern myths? And the answer to this is entirely dependent on how you define inspired. And to be clear, this video is not to discuss the theological position on inspiration. And unfortunately, what often happens is that inspiration gets conflated with dependency. The stories recorded in the Bible were written later than these other ancient Near Eastern stories. But this is not because the biblical writers are simply pulling the old edit, copy, edit, paste trick, but rather they are writing narratives based on common knowledge of the day. They are not stealing stories that they had no prior knowledge of. So perhaps we can say that the biblical text was inspired in the sense that the biblical writers wanted to communicate what they believed the truth of the common knowledge of the day was. And all of these stories fit within the literary genre of mythology, because academically, the broad definition of mythology is any story about the activity of the gods. And therefore what this means is that it's not just Genesis 1 through 11 that is mythology, but the entire biblical text. For Jews, Genesis through Chronicles, and for Christians, Genesis through Revelation. Because the main character and driving force behind every single event recorded within the biblical text is the first character that you meet in Genesis 1:1, the third word in the Hebrew text, and that is God. And because of this, both the religious and the skeptical side need to accept certain terms. On the religious side, these individuals need to accept that Genesis, as well as the rest of the biblical text, is mythology. And conversely, those on the skeptical side need to stop insisting that the theological messaging within Genesis 1 through 11, as well as the rest of the biblical text, must be false because Genesis in the Bible is mythic in literature. Because while myth is synonymous with fiction in our day and age, that is not true for the ancient Near East. Because for these cultures, the theme of myth was not the essence of the deities, but rather the essence of reality. And with myth properly defined, you can see that it's oxymoronic to state that the biblical text is a myth, then impose an improper definition of myth to falsify the details of the text. And all this is to say that we should expect similarities amongst these various texts because they shared both a common knowledge and a common worldview. Hey, if you enjoyed this clip, be sure to check out the full-length video by clicking the link right here. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more content on biblical mythology. And I will see you on the next video. Thank you so much for the support.